Da da da, and welcome to Girl Talk. It is Monday, it is Motivational Monday, and I have a really good story for you guys today that I'm really excited to tell you because this story, when I was younger, I used to go to the library all the time, and I used to always read those, like, chicken soups for the teenage souls and stuff like that, and this story, from the first time I read it, I fell in love with this story, and it makes me, like, it's a feel-good story, but it's partly sad but partly feel good, and like the ending result you feel good. And ever since the first time that I read it, I would read it over and over and over, and then I would even go back to the library and I rented out that book for like ever because I loved that story so much. So whenever I started the Motivational Mondays, I was sitting there telling myself I wanted to read that story to you guys, but I couldn't remember what it was called. So when I was sitting there just messing around today, for some reason, I don't know why it was, and I knew I was thinking of that story still, but I was just, all of a sudden, the name Claudia popped up into my head. So I went on the internet and I Googled it and I found it, and it was called Donna and Claudia. So I was like, oh my gosh, I could tell you guys this story. Now, this story is a little bit longer, but it's going to be so much fun, so it shows you how important friendship and family really is. Let me get over here and I will read it to you guys. Okay. Called Donna and Claudia. Donna is my sister, and I have always thought of her as beautiful. Our father calls her his princess. When Donna entered high school, with her long blonde hair and incredible blue eyes, she caught the attention of the boys. There were the usual crushes and high school dances, phone calls and giggles, and hours of combing and brushing her hair to make it glow. She had eyeshadow to match the perfect blue of her eyes. Our parents were protective of us, and particularly kept close watch over the boys. One Saturday in April, 3 weeks before Donna's 16th birthday, a boy called and asked her to go to an amusement park. It was in the next state, about 20 miles away. They would be going with 4 other friends. Our parents' first answer was a firm no, but Donna eventually wore them down. On her way out the door, they told her to be home by 11 and no later. It was a great night. The roller coasters were fast, the games were fun, and the food was good. Time flew by. Finally, one of them realized it was already 10:45. Being young and slightly afraid of what would happen, the boy who was driving decided he could make it home in 15 minutes. It never occurred to any of them to call and ask if they could be late. Speeding down the highway, the driver noticed an exit too late. He tried to make it anyway. The car ripped out 9 metal guardrails and flipped over 3 times before it came to a stop on its roof. Someone pulled Donna from the car, and she crawled over to check on her friends. There was blood everywhere. As she pulled her hair back from her eyes so she could see better, her hand slipped underneath her scalp. The blood was coming from her. Practically the entire top of Donna's head had been cut off, held on by just a few inches of scalp. When the police cruiser arrived to rush Donna to a nearby hospital, an officer sat with her, holding her scalp in place. Donna asked if she was going to die. He told her he didn't know what was going to happen. At home, I was watching television when a creepy feeling went through me. All I thought about was Donna. A few minutes went by and then the telephone rang. Mom answered it. She made a groaning noise and fell to the floor, calling for my father. They rushed out the door, telling my sister Terry and me that Donna had been in a car accident and that they had to go to the hospital to get her. Terry and I stayed up for hours waiting for them. We changed the sheets on Donna's bed and waited. Somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning, we pulled out the sofa bed and fell asleep together. Mom and Dad were not as prepared for what they saw at the hospital. The doctors had to wait until our parents arrived to stitch up Donna's head. They didn't expect her to survive the night. At 7 a.m., my parents returned home. Terry was still sleeping, Mom went straight into her bedroom, and Dad went into the kitchen and sat at the table. He had a white plastic garbage bag between his legs, opening it up, and when I sat down at the table, what I saw put me in shock. I asked him how Donna was, and he told me that the doctors didn't think she was going to make it. As I struggled to think about that, he started pulling her clothes out of the bag. They were soaked with blood and blonde hair. Some of the hair had Donna's scalp still attached to it. Every piece of clothing she had worn that night was soaked with blood. I can't remember thinking anything. All I did was stare at the clothes. When Terry woke up, I showed them to her. I'm sure it was an awful thing to do, but it was such a shock that it was all I could think of. At the hospital later that morning, Terry and I had to wait outside for a long time before we could see Donna. It was an old hospital, and it smelled old. Terry and I were afraid of it. Finally, we were allowed to go in and see our sister. Her head was wrapped in white gauze, and it was stained with blood. Her face was swollen, which couldn't understand because she had lost so much blood, so how could her face be swollen? I thought that she would look smaller. She reached up and touched my long brown hair and started to cry. The next day I called a neighbor who was a hairdresser and asked her to cut off all my hair. It's a funny thing, I loved my long brown hair, and it curled just right, but I never ever missed it or wanted it back after that. All I wanted was for Donna to come home and sleep in the clean sheets that Terry and I had put on her bed. Donna was in the hospital for 2 weeks. Many of her friends went to see her, especially Claudia, who was there a lot. Mom and Dad never liked Claudia. Maybe it's because she seemed fast. Maybe it's because she just spoke her mind. I don't really know. They just didn't like her being around. Donna came home with the entire top half of her head shaved. She had hundreds of stitches, some of which came across her forehead and between her left eye and eyebrow. For a while she wore a gauze cap. Eventually she had our hairdresser cut the rest of her long, beautiful hair off. It had been soaked and matted with blood that she couldn't get out. The hairdresser was such a kind person that she found Donna a human hair wig that perfectly matched her hair that she had had. Donna celebrated her 16th birthday and went back to school. I don't know where rotten people come from, and I don't know why they exist, but they do. There was a very loud-mouthed, self-centered girl in some of Donna's classes who would take great pleasure in tormenting my sister. She would sit behind her and pull slightly on Donna's wig, and she would say very quietly, "Hey, Wiggy, let's see your scars," and then she would laugh. Donna never did anything to anybody, and to her tormentor, until that day she told Claudia. Claudia was in most of Donna's classes, and from then on kept a close eye on my sister. Whenever that girl got close to Donna, Claudia would be there. There was something about Claudia that was intimidating, even to the worst kids in school. No one messed with her. Unfortunately, though, Claudia wasn't always around, and the teasing and the name-calling continued. One Friday night, Claudia called and asked Donna to come spend the night at her house. My parents didn't want Donna to go out, not just because they didn't like Claudia, but because they became so protective of Donna. In the end, they knew they had to let her go, even though they probably spent the whole night worrying. Claudia had something special waiting for my sister. She knew how awful Donna felt about her hair, so Claudia had shaved off her own hair. The next day, Donna and Claudia went wig shopping for identical blonde and brown wigs. When they went to school that Monday, Claudia was ready for the teasers. In a vocabulary not allowed inside the school walls, she set them straight, so that anybody that was ready to tease my sister knew they would have to mess with Claudia. It didn't take long for the message to get through that you don't mess with her. Donna and Claudia wore their wigs for over a year until they felt their hair had grown out long enough to take them off. Only when Donna was ready did they go out to school without them. By then she had developed a stronger self-confidence and acceptance for herself. My sister graduated from high school. She is married now and has 2 great kids. 28 years later, she is still friends with Claudia. Best friends forever. I think that is such a good story, and it makes me want to cry, like I said, every time I read it, because family and friendship is so important. And I know we all have friends, but to have a true friend like that and somebody that would do something like that for you, it takes a very special and a very strong person to be there for you and to do all the things that Claudia had done for Donna. And I think that shows true friendship and true love and true commitment. And I think that is it's so refreshing, because if you honestly sat down and think about it, if something like that was to happen to you, how many of your friends do you know would go and have all their beautiful hair shaved off just so you wouldn't have to be alone? So the lesson for the day is that go out there and be a true friend, and just let people know how much you care about them and how much you love them, and realize how important friendship is to everybody. And even sometimes people who don't act like they need friends, that's when they usually need the most friends, is when they act like they're tough and that they don't need anybody. That's usually when they need somebody. So always try to be there for somebody and be kind and respectful and loving towards one another. And tomorrow is Tuesday. It's Relationship Tuesday, and I would love to get some more relationship questions, and who knows what fun things we will get in there to talk about. So leave me in the comments below, or IM me any relationship questions or relationship advice that you need answered, and I'll be sure to get to it tomorrow. Also, I want you guys to leave me comments and let me know what you think a true friend is and what you felt about the story today, and if it touched you the way that it touched me so many years ago. Until this day, it still does. So remember, tomorrow is Topical Tuesday, and I love you guys, and I'll see you all later. Mwah! Bye!